Millionaire abandons pregnant horse to die, but then this happened. The storm raged across the Kansas prairie, whipping through the rolling hills with a ferocity that mirrored Julia's anguish. She stood in the barn doorway, her trembling hands clutching the wooden frame as she watched the taillights of a sleek black SUV vanish into the horizon. Inside the barn, the soft whimper of the pregnant mare, Bella, broke the silence, pulling Julia back to her devastating reality. The millionaire, David Albright, had left without a second glance, abandoning both Bella and the life he had promised her. Julia, a veterinarian with a heart as vast as the plains, had met David during a charity auction in Wichita. His charm was intoxicating, his wealth a stark contrast to her humble upbringing. But beyond the glittering facade, there was a vulnerability in David that Julia had believed she could heal. Now, staring at the empty driveway, she questioned every choice that had led her to this moment. Bella's story was no less tragic. The mare had been a gift from David, a symbol of their shared dreams of building a sanctuary for abandoned animals. But dreams, Julia realized, were fragile. David had walked away not only from Bella but from a commitment he had made with fervent promises under the Kansas stars. As Julia approached Bella, the mare nuzzled her hand, a silent plea for comfort. "You're not alone," Julia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We'll figure this out together." The weight of abandonment pressed heavy on her chest, but in Bella's eyes, she saw a glimmer of hope, a reminder of resilience in the face of despair. That night, Julia lay awake, replaying the moment David turned his back. Questions gnawed at her soul. What had driven him to leave so suddenly? And why had he severed ties so cruelly, abandoning not only her but the life they had built? As dawn broke over the Kansas sky, Julia resolved to uncover the truth, not knowing that the answers would lead her down a path she never could have imagined. The morning sun spilled across the prairie, bathing the landscape in gold. Julia stood in the barn, her hands gently stroking Bella's swollen belly. The mare's eyes reflected a mix of trust and sorrow, a mirror to Julia's own heart. But today wasn't a day for mourning. It was a day for answers. David had left behind more than just broken promises. He had also left a trail of contradictions. His departure had been abrupt, but Julia couldn't shake the feeling that it was premeditated. The man who had once spoken passionately about their shared future had vanished, leaving only a cryptic note: "Sometimes, love isn't enough." Julia decided to start her search in the place where it had all begun, David's estate on the outskirts of Wichita. The sprawling property, once a symbol of their dreams, now felt like a mausoleum of shattered hopes. As she approached the grand gates, a wave of trepidation washed over her. This was David's fortress, a place where his carefully guarded secrets might finally come to light. Inside the estate, Julia found David's assistant, Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman who had always seemed more loyal to her paycheck than to her employer. Eleanor's demeanor was icy, but there was a flicker of something else: hesitation. When Julia mentioned Bella and David's disappearance, Eleanor's mask faltered. "You shouldn't dig too deep," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Some things are better left buried." Eleanor's words lingered in Julia's mind as she returned home that evening. The assistant had known something that could explain David's sudden betrayal. Julia sat by Bella's stall, her resolve hardening. Whatever secrets David was hiding, she owed it to herself and Bella to uncover the truth. For now, all she had were questions, but she felt the answers were closer than ever, waiting to be unearthed. Julia's curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She couldn't let Eleanor's cryptic warning deter her. As the days passed, Julia began piecing together fragments of David's past, hoping to unravel the mystery behind his departure. Every lead seemed to point to one place: his childhood hometown, a small, forgotten village nestled deep in the Ozarks. The drive to the village was long, the winding roads flanked by towering pines that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. Julia had learned from old documents that David's family had owned a modest ranch here, far from the wealth and grandeur he later achieved. But the ranch had been sold decades ago, and the Albright name had all but vanished from the area. When Julia arrived, she found a place frozen in time. The general store's bell jingled as she entered, drawing the attention of the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a kind smile. "You're not from around here," he observed, his voice tinged with curiosity. Julia hesitated before asking, "Do you remember the Albright family?" The man's expression darkened. "The Albrights," he repeated, his tone heavy. "They left years ago, after the tragedy." Julia's pulse quickened. "What tragedy?" she pressed, desperate for answers. The man hesitated, then leaned in as if the walls themselves might eavesdrop. Their youngest son, Sam, went missing. Never found him. The family was never the same after that. Julia left the store with more questions than answers. A missing brother? David had never mentioned siblings, let alone a loss so profound. Back at her motel, she combed through public records, uncovering a grim pattern. David's family had reported Sam missing when David was just 10 years old. The boy's disappearance had devastated the family, driving them into isolation. As Julia stared at the screen, a chill ran down her spine. Could this long-buried tragedy have something to do with David's recent actions? The pieces didn't fit, but Julia knew she was on the verge of something big. Somewhere in the shadows of David's past lay the key to understanding his present. Determined to dig deeper, Julia returned to the village the next day. This time, her destination was the local library, a small, dusty building that seemed more like a relic than a functioning institution. Among the aging shelves, she found archived newspapers and documents about the Albright family and Sam's disappearance. Flipping through brittle pages, Julia uncovered fragments of the story. Sam had vanished during a family outing near a local river. The search had been exhaustive but fruitless, and whispers of foul play had haunted the community for years. The family's grief eventually forced them to leave the town, severing ties with their old life. Just as Julia was about to give up for the day, the librarian approached her with a small, weathered journal. "This was in a box of donations a few months ago," she said. "It belonged to someone named Sam Albright. Thought you might find it interesting." Julia's heart raced as she took the journal, its cover cracked but intact. Inside were the thoughts of a child, innocent musings about the ranch, dreams of adventure, and cryptic references to a game he played with his brother, David. One entry caught her attention. David said, "We can't tell anyone about the cave. It's our secret place. If we do, bad things will happen." The words sent a chill through Julia. A secret cave? Could it be connected to Sam's disappearance? She needed to know more. Julia's next stop was the river where Sam had last been seen. The area had overgrown with time, but Julia felt an eerie familiarity as she explored the banks. After hours of searching, she found a narrow trail leading into the woods. Following it, she stumbled upon the mouth of a cave, its entrance hidden by thick vines. The air inside was damp and heavy as Julia stepped into the darkness. Her flashlight illuminated faint markings on the walls, childish carvings of animals, stick figures, and, most hauntingly, the words, "Keep the secret." Julia's breath hitched. Whatever had happened here, it was more than a child's innocent game. She realized she was walking into a piece of David's past that even he might not fully understand or want to remember. Julia's flashlight trembled in her hand as she stepped deeper into the cave. The air was thick with dampness and an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint dripping of water. The carvings on the walls grew more intricate the further she ventured, shifting from playful doodles to chaotic scratches. She couldn't shake the feeling that the cave held a story, one etched in fear and desperation. Near the end of the cave, Julia stumbled upon a small, hollowed-out area. Scattered on the ground were remnants of childhood, an old metal lunchbox, a broken slingshot, and a tattered notebook. She picked up the notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile, and began to read. The entries were written in Sam's childish handwriting, but they grew darker with each page. He wrote about in shadow games that David had insisted they play. At first, it seemed innocent, a treasure hunt, exploring the cave. But Sam's later entries spoke of fear. "David says the shadow watches us. He says if we leave, it'll follow me home." The last entry was chilling. "I don't want to play anymore. David says I have to." Julia's stomach turned. Was this just the imagination of a scared child, or was there something more sinister? She stuffed the notebook into her bag and turned to leave, but something on the ground caught her eye. It was a rusted chain, anchored into the wall. Her breath hitched as she realized what it could mean. As Julia exited the cave, the sunlight stung her eyes, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. She couldn't shake the implications of what she had found. Did David know what had happened to his brother? Had he been involved? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had come looking for answers, but now she had only more questions, and the uneasy feeling that she wasn't the only one seeking the truth. Back at her motel, Julia spread out the clues she had collected: the journal, the notebook, and the fragments of David's past she had pieced together. She knew she needed to confront him, but how? The man she thought she knew was slipping further into the shadows of his own secrets, and Julia feared that uncovering the truth might shatter them both. The weight of the cave's secrets haunted Julia as she drove back to the ranch. The evidence she had gathered was undeniable, but it was only a fraction of the story. The puzzle pieces fit together in a way that terrified her: David, the shadow game, Sam's disappearance, and the cave. She had to confront David, no matter the cost. She dialed his number for what felt like the 100th time, but it went straight to voicemail. David hadn't responded to any of her attempts at contact since his abrupt departure. Desperation set in, but Julia knew what she had to do. She couldn't wait any longer. She would confront him at his estate, no matter how dangerous it might be. As the clock struck midnight, Julia stood outside the gates of David's mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. The property was shrouded in darkness, the grand house looming like a fortress. But Julia's resolve was unwavering. She would demand answers. The security guard at the front gate gave her a wary look but didn't stop her as she walked past him. She had always been determined, but tonight, there was something different in her eyes. An edge, a coldness forged from the raw truth she had uncovered. Julia made her way to the back of the house, where the door to David's study stood ajar. She pushed it open, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. David was sitting by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand, his back turned to her. His posture was stiff, like he had been waiting for her. He didn't flinch when she entered, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "You found it," he said, his voice low and resigned. Julia's heart raced as she stepped forward. "I found everything, David. The cave, the journal, the game. Why did you leave? Why did you abandon Bella? And what happened to Sam?" The floodgates opened, and her words tumbled out in a torrent of anger and pain. David's silence was deafening. He slowly turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sorrow. "I didn't want you to find out," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't want anyone to know what happened. But it's too late now." Julia's pulse quickened. "What happened, David?" she demanded. David took a deep breath, his face pale in the dim light. "Sam isn't dead, Julia. He never left the cave." Julia's world seemed to collapse around her. Sam wasn't dead? The words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. She had read the articles, the reports. There was no mention of Sam ever being found. Everything pointed to him having vanished all those years ago, swallowed by the earth. But now, David's revelation shattered that belief. David's eyes were distant, haunted. He took another slow sip of whiskey, his hands shaking as he set the glass down on the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he murmured. "When we were kids, Sam and I, we found the cave. We made it our secret, our refuge from the world. But something changed." Julia's breath caught as she sat down across from him. The flickering light of the chandelier cast long shadows across David's face, but she could see the torment in his eyes. "What do you mean, something changed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David closed his eyes as though trying to block out the memory. "Sam started to change. He became obsessed with the cave, with the shadow we thought we had imagined. He said he could hear it, feel it watching him. I thought he was just a scared kid, but he wouldn't let it go. He became violent. He stopped being the brother I knew." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "And then," she prompted, her voice shaking. David swallowed hard. "I tried to stop him. I couldn't. One night, Sam disappeared. I was supposed to protect him, but I couldn't. I thought I had lost him, but then," his voice cracked and he looked away, unable to meet Julia's gaze. "I found him again. But he wasn't the same. The cave had changed him. There's something there, Julia? Something we didn't understand. The shadow, it's real. It's been feeding on him all these years. And now, he's not just my brother. There's something else. The silence in the room was suffocating. Julia could hardly breathe as the weight of David's words sank in. Sam had never left the cave. And whatever had happened to him in that dark, hidden place had twisted him beyond recognition. But why hadn't David told anyone? Why had he kept this horrific truth buried for so long? Julia's voice trembled as she asked the question that had been haunting her. Why didn't you tell me, David? Why didn't you tell anyone? David's face twisted with shame and regret. Because I thought it was too late to save him. I thought if I left it all behind, I could forget. But now, with Bella, I can't run anymore. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. What do you mean, you can't run? What's going to happen now? David stood abruptly, his eyes wide with panic. I don't know. But Sam, he's coming for you, Julia. He knows you found out. And when he comes, you won't be able to stop him. No one can. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with unspoken truths and looming dread. David's words hung in the silence, like a warning bell tolling in the distance. Sam, his brother, lost to the shadows of the cave, was coming. But Julia didn't understand what that meant. What had he become? What could he possibly want with her? David's frantic pacing made the shadows dance across the room, his once confident demeanor unraveling before Julia's eyes. He's not human anymore, Julia, David said, his voice cracking. Whatever happened to him down there, it changed him. The cave, it's alive. And Sam, he's its vessel. Julia could barely process the words, her mind reeling. The cave, the shadow, it all felt too fantastical, too monstrous to believe. And yet, David's terror seemed so real, so raw. She had seen the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his brother, the guilt that seemed to gnaw at his very soul. Whatever had happened in that cave, it had shattered David as much as it had Sam. How do you know he's coming? Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, the tension thick like a storm waiting to break. David ran his hands through his hair, his eyes wild. Because he always comes for the ones who know the truth. He's bound to the cave now, but he can reach out. He can make you see things. The longer you're near him, the closer you get to the cave, the harder it is to escape. A cold shiver ran down Julia's spine. She felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just a story about a lost brother. It was about something far darker, something that couldn't be undone. Before she could ask any more questions, a faint noise echoed through the house, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind. Then it grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from the direction of the study door. Julia's heart skipped a beat. David froze, his face drained of color. He's here, he whispered. It's too late. He found us. Julia felt her pulse race as she turned toward the door, but the only sound that reached her ears now was a low, guttural growl, like something ancient and predatory. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt frozen in place. And then the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a man, but not a man. His eyes were wild, hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his body was gaunt, the flesh stretched too tight across his bones. Sam's face, or what was left of it, was a grotesque mask of twisted recognition. His lips curled into a mocking grin. David, Julia, I see you found each other, Sam's voice rasped, low and unnerving. You should have stayed away. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the impossible sight before her. The brother she had imagined as lost forever was standing there, but he was no longer the innocent child he had once been. This was something else entirely. David's voice trembled. Sam, please stop. You don't have to do this. Sam's smile widened, his gaze shifting to Julia. It's too late. You can't run from the cave. It owns you now. Before Julia could react, Sam took a step forward, his long fingers reaching out, claws-like and dark. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, to pulse with a life of their own. The walls groaned under the pressure, as if the house itself were alive. In that instant, Julia realized that she was no longer just fighting for the truth, she was fighting for her life. And the terrifying thing was, she had no idea if she could win. The room seemed to close in around Julia as Sam took another step forward. His hollow, empty eyes never left hers, and the shadows around him writhed like living creatures. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and Julia felt the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing against her chest. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but the terror in her veins kept her frozen in place. David stood beside her, his eyes wide with fear, a futile sense of desperation in his voice. "Sam, please, stop," he pleaded, but Sam's grin only deepened, as though the words were meaningless. Julia's heart raced. She couldn't wait for David to save them. She had to act. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby lamp and hurled it towards Sam. The shattering glass echoed through the room, but Sam didn't flinch. Instead, the shadows around him seemed to grow thicker, swirling in a vortex of darkness that threatened to swallow everything in sight. "Run!" David shouted, grabbing Julia's arm and pulling her toward the door. But it was too late. The shadows surged, engulfing the doorway. Julia stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat as the walls seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't comprehend. Sam stepped forward, and with each movement, the shadows seemed to come alive, wrapping themselves around his form like a cloak. "You can't escape," Sam hissed, his voice like a low, guttural growl. "The cave is everywhere now. It follows me. It owns me. And soon, it will own you too." David pulled Julia back again, but this time, there was something different in his eyes: resignation. "We have to go to the cave," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's the only place we can stop this." Julia shook her head, disbelief clouding her mind. "What are you talking about? How can the cave stop this?" David's gaze darkened, and he took a shaky breath. "The cave? It's not just a place, Julia. It's a doorway. The shadows feed on those who enter it, and the longer you stay, the harder it is to leave." Sam went in there to escape his demons, but it took him. It changed him. But there's a way to end this. There's a way to sever the connection between him and the cave. Julia felt her stomach churn. The cave, the shadow, it had all been real. And now, she was standing on the precipice of something even darker than she had imagined. She didn't know if she could face it, but the alternative, staying in this suffocating nightmare, was worse. "We have to stop him, Julia," David urged, his voice shaking with both fear and determination. "We have to go back to the cave. It's the only chance we have." With no other choice, Julia nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what awaited them in that cave, but she knew that if they didn't go, Sam would continue to hunt them, and the shadows would only grow stronger. Together, they fled the house, with Sam's twisted laughter echoing in their ears. The night had fallen, and the road to the cave seemed impossibly far. But in the darkness ahead, Julia knew the final confrontation awaited. And somehow, she knew that the truth about Sam, about the shadows, and about David would either save them or destroy them all. The journey to the cave was a blur. The world around them seemed to lose all sense of direction as they sped through the night. The trees, the roads, even the stars above seemed to warp, twisted by the tension in the air. Julia's mind was racing. How had it come to this? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? But the answers were somewhere deep in that cave. She had to face the horrors within, no matter the cost. David was driving with a wild urgency, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's not just about stopping Sam," he muttered, almost to himself. "It's about stopping everything. The cave's power, it doesn't just control him, it's been reaching out, trying to take us all." Julia barely heard him. Her thoughts were focused on one thing: surviving. The weight of the past few days was too much to carry, too many unanswered questions, too much pain. And yet, beneath it all, something else was growing, an understanding that she couldn't ignore. David wasn't just trying to protect her. He was trying to protect himself. When they reached the cave, the night air was thick with a heavy, unnatural stillness. The familiar forest that had seemed so tranquil now felt oppressive, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Julia's stomach twisted with unease as she stepped out of the car, but there was no turning back. David stood beside her, looking at the cave with a mixture of fear and determination. "Sam will be waiting inside," he warned, "and the shadow will try to take us. But remember, once we're in there, nothing is as it seems." Julia nodded, steeling herself. This wasn't just about Sam anymore. This was about destroying the power of the cave, ending whatever it was that had ensnared him. The entrance to the cave was just as it had been before, dark and foreboding, its maw like a waiting beast. Sam's presence was palpable, a force that hung in the air like a storm ready to break. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing against the stone, and the shadows seemed to close in on them, thick and alive. As they ventured deeper, the cave began to twist in impossible ways. Walls that shouldn't have existed appeared, paths that led nowhere stretched out in front of them, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the cave itself were a living entity, shifting to confound them, to draw them deeper into its heart. "Sam," David shouted into the darkness. "We're here. It's time to end this." The response came not in words, but in a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. Shadows swirled, coalescing into a form that was both familiar and alien. Sam's figure emerged from the darkness, his once human shape now an unrecognizable silhouette of darkness, its edges flickering like a dying flame. His eyes were no longer human, hollow, endless voids that seemed to consume all light. "You should have stayed away," Sam's voice rasped from the darkness, distorted and cold. David stepped forward, trembling but resolute. "Sam, this is over. The cave, the shadow, none of it is real. It's all in your head. Let it go." But Sam's laugh was hollow, a sound that reverberated through the cave like a death knell. "You don't understand, do you?" he hissed. "The cave doesn't want me to leave. It doesn't want any of us to leave." Julia's heart pounded in her chest as the ground beneath them began to tremble. The shadows around them seemed to surge forward, and the walls closed in, narrowing their escape. She knew they had only one chance to stop this, to sever the connection between Sam and the cave. But how? What could they do against something so ancient, so powerful? And then it clicked. The journal. The game. The truth. "David!" Julia cried, her voice trembling with realization. "The journal, the cave feeds on secrets." Sam was right. It's not just about him, it's about us, all of us. We've been running from the truth, burying it, but it's been controlling us this whole time. David's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed to understand what she meant. The truth was the key. The cave fed on their guilt, their fear, their lies. The longer they denied the past, the more it controlled them. "Sam," Julia shouted, her voice fierce. "We don't have to live in the shadow anymore. We can end this. You're not alone, you never were." For a moment, Sam's twisted form seemed to falter, the shadows flickering like a flame on the verge of going out. His hollow eyes softened just a fraction. "It's too late for me," he whispered. "I'm already lost." But Julia refused to give up. "No," she cried. "It's never too late. You can come back. You can fight this." And in that moment, something incredible happened. The shadows recoiled, as if recoiling from the light of their combined resolve. The cave trembled violently, its walls shifting, cracking. It wasn't over, but they had made a crack in the foundation of the darkness that had consumed them all. With one last, desperate cry, the shadows receded, taking Sam's twisted form with them into the depths of the cave. Julia and David collapsed to the ground, breathless and exhausted, but alive. The cave was silent. The darkness was gone. For now, at least. But Julia knew that the battle for the truth wasn't over. They had won this round, but the real challenge lay ahead, healing the past and finding a way to live in the light.